What would you do if one day you were arrested for something you didn't do? The police just look at you and decide you're guilty, even though all you did was buy a cup of coffee. Daniel Hall, an ordinary man who always avoids trouble, found himself pulled into an unwanted struggle. Officer Hannah Scott decided he was a suspect, even though all the evidence proved his innocence. What would you do if you were caught in the middle of false accusations? Share your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever faced such injustice? Don't forget to subscribe to follow the next part of this story. Daniel Hall was the type of person who liked stability, avoided trouble, and lived a well-planned life. His days, from work to the smallest of habits, were neatly organized, with no room for risk or disruption. He just wanted simple things: a stable job, a quiet home, and normal mornings with a cup of black coffee. Today was like any other day. He stopped by the convenience store in Fort Worth, Texas, to pick up a few items: a strong black coffee and a light snack. Just simple things. Daniel walked into the store with a relaxed, weary mood after a long day. Everything felt familiar. The dim fluorescent lights, the silent shelves, the quiet space made him feel like he was in a separate world, far from the noisy world outside. But then, unexpectedly, an uneasy feeling rose in him. A sense of tension for no clear reason, as if some unseen force was pulling him towards something unwanted. He felt like someone was watching him. His steps slowed, and though he couldn't see anything different, he couldn't shake the feeling. Suddenly, a firm voice startled him. "Sir, I need you to stop right there." He turned around and saw a uniformed police officer, her hand resting lightly on her weapon in its holster. The strange feeling inside him shifted into confusion and worry. Why me, he thought, realizing that this situation couldn't just be a misunderstanding. In the tense silence of the store, one big question formed in Daniel's mind. Why am I being treated like this? He felt the conflict within himself, from unease to frustration, as he realized that things were going in a direction he never wanted. This wasn't just a mistake. For him, this could be the beginning of an endless nightmare. In the quiet store, there was no one else but Daniel and Officer Hannah Scott, a stern figure who stepped closer to him. She stood there, saying nothing, but her sharp gaze never left Daniel. Her hands rested on her weapon, her stance ready as though an attack was imminent. Daniel felt a cold sweat run down his spine. This has to be a misunderstanding, he thought, but her voice cut through his thoughts. "Sir, I need you to stop right there," Hannah's voice rang out, cold and authoritative. Daniel froze, his heart pounding in his chest. He turned to look at her, eyes wide, feeling the tension in the air. How could this be happening? He had just come here to buy coffee and a snack. "Sir, show me the receipt," she continued without hesitation. Daniel took a deep breath, his hands beginning to shake, not out of fear, but because of the surprise. He had already paid for everything, but her gaze was distrustful, as if she didn't believe he could be innocent. How could this be? Daniel wondered. But he didn't dare resist. Regret welled up inside him. He wasn't a thief. He wasn't someone who would do that. But why was the police suspicious of him? Just because he was dressed simply. Just because he looked like someone who could easily be misjudged. Unanswered questions floated through his mind. What do I do now? This had changed everything. He was being forced to prove his innocence to someone who didn't even doubt the truth. Daniel pulled the receipt from his pocket and handed it to her. His hands were still trembling slightly, his eyes fixed on her. Hannah glanced over the receipt quickly, then shook her head. "Not correct," she said coldly. This made him feel even more disappointed. This wasn't just a simple receipt check. It was the beginning of discrimination he couldn't escape from. He never expected that the quiet life he had built would be upended by a misunderstanding. The feeling of loss, not only of freedom, but of recognition, swelled inside him. "I'll prove my innocence," he told himself. But the truth was, even if he did, would anyone truly believe him? Daniel stood there holding the receipt, his eyes never leaving Hannah. But inside, unease began to overshadow all other thoughts. It felt like there was an invisible wall rising between them, a wall he couldn't get past. What was the reason? Why was she doubting him? A man who had simply walked into the store to buy a few basic things. Everything seemed so unclear, and he couldn't understand how things had escalated to this point. Hannah looked at him, her gaze cold, as if she was evaluating every action he made, every second. The feeling of being watched and judged without understanding the reason was so uncomfortable, it was indescribable. Daniel couldn't know how he was being perceived, but he could feel the tension in the air. People around seemed to start glancing over, their eyes shifting between him and Hannah like a silent standoff. A few customers were quietly observing, creating a heavy and suffocating atmosphere. "Sir, I need you to stop right there." Hannah's voice rang out, sharp and unarguable. She didn't even need a reason, no explanation, just an order, and Daniel had no choice but to stand there, feeling like he was being swept into an inescapable situation. He remained patient, not resisting, but inside an invisible sense of worry swelled. When Hannah reported over the radio, her voice was firm and unhesitating. "There's a suspect possibly shoplifting who is resisting compliance." Everything in Daniel's mind seemed to collapse in that moment. Shoplifting? He was a suspect? Just because he couldn't quell the unease lurking inside her? He had paid for everything. He had done everything right. But now he was a criminal in her eyes. A wave of hopelessness flooded him. Patience no longer seemed enough to soothe the hurt. He felt like he was standing on a road with no way out, where no matter what he said, no matter how he proved his innocence, she had already decided he was a criminal. The sense of loss and pain surged. He had lived carefully, avoiding trouble, but now, just because of a misunderstanding and lack of trust, he had been drawn into a fight he wasn't prepared for. A big question formed in his mind. Does the truth even matter when someone has already made up their mind? The cold grip of the handcuffs around Daniel's wrists made it hard for him to breathe. Everything was happening too quickly, as if he was being swept into a whirlwind that couldn't be stopped. Even though a store employee confirmed that he had paid for everything, Hannah didn't care. She didn't change her decision. Now, Daniel felt anger and frustration rising inside him. But he knew, no matter what he said, it wouldn't matter. Hannah didn't just cuff him. She made him feel like a criminal, someone who had no right to speak the truth. The eyes of the people around him glanced over, filled with suspicion, as if they had already believed he had done something wrong. A strange feeling rose within him, a sense of loneliness, a lack of recognition, and the realization that there was no way to change a decision that had already been made. As they walked out of the store, Daniel's eyes glanced at the window, and he saw his own reflection. For the first time in his life, he saw himself like this: arrested, handcuffed, perceived as a criminal. He had seen others in this situation, but he never thought he would be the next one. A big question flashed through his mind. How can someone be judged just for their appearance and suspicion when the truth is so clear? The feeling of regret and disappointment surged. He couldn't understand why people could see him like this, even though all the evidence proved his innocence. But amidst the tension, a flicker of hope shone through. Could he stand up and prove he wasn't what they thought he was? Could the truth change everything? Or would he have to accept a flawed system that was wrong from the start? This shock wasn't just the confusion of a fleeting moment, but a bigger challenge Daniel had never been prepared for. As the patrol car drove through the quiet streets of Fort Worth, Texas, Daniel sat silently in the back seat, his hands tightly handcuffed. The dim light of the street lamps reflected through the car windows, making him feel like he was drifting into another world. A world he had never imagined he would be drawn into. A world where the truth no longer mattered, only suspicion and judgment. The feeling of being abandoned in the darkness made his heart tighten. He couldn't understand why everything had turned out like this. All the evidence pointed to his innocence. He had paid for all the items. The store clerk had confirmed that. Yet Hannah Scott still held on to her decision, unchanged, even though she knew she was wrong. But throughout the ride to the police station, Daniel didn't say a word. He didn't want to say anything anymore. Didn't want to prove his innocence with empty words. He could feel the injustice in Hannah's actions, but he also understood that no amount of justification would help him. Amid the pain, he felt an indescribable sense of disappointment. Why face this kind of discrimination? He had lived a quiet life, staying away from trouble, and now he had to face a battle he was never prepared for. Could he find hope in the midst of this storm? Everything seemed to be against him. but a part of him still didn't give up. He knew he had to fight, not only to prove his innocence, but for others who shouldn't have to go through what he was experiencing. The upcoming legal battle wouldn't be easy, but Daniel felt a strange strength building within him. Maybe he couldn't change the world, but at least he wouldn't let these mistakes and prejudices continue to exist. The silence in the patrol car wasn't just a sense of stagnation, it was also a sign of preparation. He would face this injustice, even if he had to fight until the end. And he would do it not just for himself, but for others, those who didn't have the chance to speak up. When Daniel entered the police station, everything around him seemed to fade, leaving only the sound of his footsteps echoing down the long, dark hallway. The feeling of being trapped wasn't just because of the handcuffs tightening on his wrists, but because of the injustice weighing heavily on him. He had told himself that no matter what happened, he wouldn't stay silent. He wouldn't let others decide his fate based on false assumptions. "I'll defend myself," Daniel said firmly to the officer who was taking him into the courtroom. Each step he took in the courtroom felt like a deep breath, where all his hopes rested on the possibility of speaking the truth. Everything moved quickly, but each second in that room felt like it stretched on endlessly. Daniel stood before the court, not with a lawyer representing him, but only with the resolve in his heart. The unspoken questions from the eyes of those around him, from the prosecutor to the onlookers, created a tension almost unbearable. Officer Hannah Scott stood across from him, her expression unchanged, her voice cold as she gave her testimony. "I saw the defendant steal an item and refuse to cooperate." The entire room seemed to hold its breath, waiting for her every word. But Daniel didn't stop staring at her, refusing to let the distortion in Hannah's statement shake him. He stood firm, with only one purpose: to expose the truth. The twist came unexpectedly when Daniel asked to review the security footage from the store. What seemed like a simple request was surprisingly powerful. Could everything change just because of one video? A sense of regret for the mistakes in Hannah's actions began to rise. She had let her judgment cloud the truth. Daniel felt a flicker of hope. Perhaps only the truth could change everything. With that simple request, everyone in the courtroom began to reassess. "I didn't do anything wrong," Daniel repeated, his eyes never leaving the screen where the security footage was being shown. The suspense, the surprise mixed together as the video proved his innocence. The big question now was, could the truth overturn a situation that everyone had believed was right? The answer no longer mattered. It was time for Daniel to reclaim justice for himself. Daniel stood firm in the courtroom, the anticipation and tension building with every passing minute. All eyes were on him, while Officer Hannah Scott remained across from him, cold and unyielding, like the walls he felt closing in around him. But today he would not let this injustice stop him. He had been patient up until now, and it was time to prove that the truth could change everything. "Your Honor, I paid for all the items," Daniel said, his voice calm but full of determination. He placed the receipt on the table, his hands steady and resolute. He had paid for everything, yet Hannah Scott's testimony made him seem like a criminal. She not only rejected the receipt, but also confirmed the false accusation, treating him as a thief without reasonable cause. The unexpected twist came when Daniel requested to review the arrest report and expose the shortcomings in her handling of the situation. A wave of regret and disappointment began to rise within him. He had once believed that justice still existed, that no one could ignore the truth. But now it was Hannah's errors, along with the deficiencies in her report, that left him no choice but to speak up. All those mistakes, the inaccurate testimony, were now being revealed before everyone. A witness stepped forward, confirming that Daniel had paid for his items. He hadn't taken anything without paying. Hope surged within Daniel as he saw a glimmer of light at the end of the tunnel. He knew that even though the truth might be difficult, even though justice sometimes comes too late, today he would not let people like Hannah continue to make wrongful judgments. The big question, Daniel thought to himself, can the truth change everything? The evidence was clear, but would justice truly be served? He looked toward the judge, and in that moment, he felt a connection with those who fought for truth and justice. The judge sat silently, her eyes fixed on Hannah Scott, her expression reflecting the tension, as though the truth had been uncovered, but still wasn't quite within reach. In the courtroom, the air seemed to freeze. Daniel looked at the judge, the excitement and tension quietly seeping into every part of his body. He couldn't have imagined that after all the mistakes, a flicker of hope would shine through. The judge pushed her glasses up, her gaze sharp, cutting through the air. "Officer Scott, I'm ordering an internal investigation into your conduct," she said, her voice powerful yet compassionate. It was an unexpected twist. No one in the courtroom had imagined that such a small action could change everything. The silence that enveloped the room made the judge's words feel like a powerful wave, sweeping away all doubt, creating not just a sense of change, but also the final victory of justice. Hannah Scott stood frozen, her hands clenched tightly, a suffocating feeling taking over her every move. Her mistakes were becoming clear. The image of Daniel handcuffed without justification. The unjust suspicions. Everything was laid bare before the court. A sense of regret rose within Daniel. Would she realize the harm she had caused? But he didn't have time to dwell on regrets. The big question echoed in his mind. Can a mistake be corrected? Hope surged within him stronger than ever. He wasn't just fighting for himself. He was fighting for those who couldn't speak up. He could feel the change approaching, like a powerful wave washing away all injustices, carrying him and all those who had been overlooked toward a fairer future. The sense of connection with those in the courtroom, those who believed in the truth, was a magical strength. Daniel understood that while this battle wasn't easy, today he had won a major victory, the victory of justice and truth. The feeling of relief mixed with tension as Daniel walked out of the courtroom. He couldn't believe what had just happened, the feeling of victory spreading through every cell of his body. He had won the lawsuit. Everything, all the exhaustion and perseverance over the past days, had led to this moment. But just as the satisfaction began to settle, a powerful thought suddenly overtook his mind. This victory isn't just mine, Daniel thought quietly. A wave of surprise and empathy rose within him as he realized that this wasn't just a personal victory. It was a victory for all those who didn't have the chance to fight against discrimination and injustice. Those who couldn't speak up, those who didn't have the power to defend themselves, those who were constantly misjudged because of race, gender, or their circumstances. The regret in his heart couldn't be completely erased. He thought about all the people who couldn't win, those who weren't strong enough to face discrimination, those whom the system had overlooked, those who couldn't stand up like he had. Those moments made him feel like he was the only lucky one among them. But then, hope began to glow again. The sense of connection he had felt in the courtroom, when the judge made the right decision, when everyone in the room started believing in the truth, made him realize that justice can prevail if everyone stands up and fights. And one important question kept repeating in his mind: can I help others like me, those who can't defend themselves? This wasn't just about him. It was about all the people who had been oppressed, misunderstood. And with a promise to himself, he knew what he had to do next. As Daniel walked out of the courthouse, he wasn't just carrying a legal victory, but also a belief in a fairer world, a world where justice is not forgotten, and everyone has the opportunity to speak up, to fight for their rights. After the victory in the courtroom, Daniel felt like he had changed. Though he could feel the relief slowly enveloping him, not all those emotions were comfortable. He knew that his victory wasn't just a personal highlight. Behind it was a painful truth he couldn't ignore. Not everyone has the opportunity to fight like he did. Those without financial means, power, or the resources to protect their rights will always fall through the cracks of the legal system, and sometimes they will never get the chance to speak up. The feeling of regret and empathy rose within him as he thought about those who couldn't get justice. He had seen them, people like him, silent in the dark, with no one standing up for them. That feeling couldn't be shaken off, and the more he thought about it, the more he realized that this fight wasn't just for him. It was for everyone who had been overlooked, dismissed, misjudged. Should I do something? This question repeated in his mind like an irresistible urge. And then his hope began to turn into action. After everything he had gone through, he decided he wouldn't stand on the sidelines anymore. I have to do something. He began planning for a legal defense fund, a venture that would not only help those without financial means, but also give them access to justice. A place where the forgotten could find support, a place where no one was judged just because they didn't have the means to fight. With each step on this journey, Daniel felt a powerful connection to those in need. He knew that fighting wasn't just an individual endeavor, but a long-term battle to change what was unjust. He no longer thought about his personal life, but about the people he could help. And when he stood before those who needed support, the question he asked himself was, can I make a difference? The answer didn't come immediately, but he knew that every small action could change an entire system. When one life changes, a system will slowly change with it. Daniel walked outside, his eyes gazing into the distance, feeling that he was on the right path, because he was no longer alone on this journey. Daniel's story is a profound lesson about justice, resilience, and the importance of standing up for the truth, even in the most difficult circumstances. The first lesson is not to judge others based on appearances or false assumptions. Daniel wasn't just a victim of discrimination. He was also a symbol for those overlooked by the system, those who couldn't defend themselves. The second lesson is about the power of patience and resilience in the fight for justice. Despite facing injustice and challenges, Daniel didn't give up. He understood that only the truth could change everything, and even when everything seemed to be against him, he had to fight to protect his rights. Finally, the story teaches us that hope and action can make a difference. After winning the lawsuit, Daniel didn't see his victory as a personal achievement, but realized his responsibility for those who couldn't protect themselves within the legal system. He decided to start a legal defense fund to help the underprivileged, proving that every small action, even by an individual, can create great change in society. Through this story, we learn that justice is not something naturally granted, but the result of continuous efforts and the courage to stand up when facing injustice.